In January 1924, WAMPAS, that's the Western Association of Motion Picture Advertisers, announced the Baby Stars of the Year. This annual promotional campaign honored not literal babies, but the future stars of America, 13 young actresses who they believed were on the threshold of movie stardom. In 1924, 17-year-old Clara Bow was among them. Described as an irrepressible brunette flapper, Clara Bow had, in just 2 short years, impressed critics and audiences alike, suggesting that she had a bright future as a silent film actress. That was almost exactly 100 years ago as of the publication of this video. And the fact that we're still talking about her today, that one of the biggest pop stars in the world chose her name as the title of a song on her latest album, suggests that indeed she did become a major star, one that left a lasting mark on the way we think about celebrity and women in film. In this video, I want to provide a guide to Clara Bow, what made her special as an actress, what made her celebrity so chaotic, and what she can tell us about stardom today. Nobody would have expected Clara Bow to become one of the defining personalities of the 1920s, and occasionally the most talked about woman in America. Born in a tenement building in Brooklyn, New York, to an unstable, impoverished family, nobody expected her to be much of anything. In fact, I'd be willing to say that of all the dreadful childhoods I've read about in the course of my research for this channel, Clara Bow's might actually be the worst. She lived through some truly unspeakable horrors, including but not limited to her grandfather dying right in front of her, her good friend burning to death in front of her mother trying to kill her with a butcher knife, her mother locking her in the closet to hide her while she performed sex work, her mother's institutionalization and death, her father beating her father raping her. I list these things not to trivialize what happened to Bow. Rather, I list them because I think it's important to understand the gravity of these years. One, because, as you might imagine, events like these are likely to scar a person. And that was certainly true of Clara, as we'll talk about more later. And 2, I want you to understand what it would mean for Clara to escape. She came from some of the least enviable circumstances, had almost no support system to speak of, and virtually no education. If she were going to find a way out of Brooklyn and abject poverty, she would have to do it on her own. Clara may not have had much, but she did have the movies. In this lonesome time, when I wasn't much of anything and hadn't anybody, I had one haven of refuge, she later said. Just one place where I could go and forget the misery and gloom of home, the loneliness and heartache of school. That was to the motion pictures. For the first time, I saw distant lands, serene, lovely homes, romance, nobility, glamour. My whole heart was afire, and my love was the motion picture. Not just the people of the screen, but everything that the magic silver sheet could represent to a starved, unhappy child. What if, she wondered, she could do more than watch? What if she could be part of the make-believe herself? So Clara quietly fostered her dream to become an actress. And when she opened Motion Picture Magazine in 1921 and saw a big headline, Fame and Fortune Contest, she paid attention. Are you young? Are you pretty? Can you act? Have you a personality? Do you photograph well? If you possess all of these qualifications, you're exactly what we're looking for, the ad read. The prize? A small role in a feature film, a chance to pursue her dream. All she had to do was send in her photograph. She did, was selected as a finalist, and asked to go through a short audition process for a selection committee. According to David Stenn's wonderful biography, Running Wild, Clara had the benefit of going last and observing the contestants in front of her and every mistake they made. She later described her success in the audition. The trouble was, I thought, that they was all trying to do it like somebody they'd seen on the screen, not the way they'd do it themselves. When it came to my turn, I did it the way I'd do it myself. And that's the key to Clara Bow right there. Her personality, more than anything else, made her a star. The selection committee, like America in just a few years' time, loved her charm, and the 16-year-old was chosen as the winner out of thousands of applicants. The announcement of her win in Motion Picture Magazine read that she had a genuine spark of divine fire, and while her mother was furious that she even entered the contest in the first place, this is when she tried to kill her with the butcher knife, Clara was still able to claim her prize with a role in the film Beyond the Rainbow, which she was completely cut out of. But you know what? No worries. Elmer Clifton, the director of the upcoming film Down to the Sea in Ships, saw her picture in Motion Picture Magazine and, in need of cheap talent, recruited her to play Dot, a restless, mischievous child of the sea who desperately wants to become a whaler, but can't because why else? That's a man's job. So Dot dresses as a boy and sneaks aboard the whaling ship anyway. She's discovered and chaos breaks out among the crew. This might sound like a pretty big role to give a random teenager who essentially had zero experience beyond winning a contest, but the role wasn't originally as substantial as it appears in the final film, where it still remains more of a B-plot to a conventional ingenue romance. But once Clara got to set and Clifton realized what a natural talent he had on his hands, he began adding more for her to do. Critics didn't think very much of Down to the Sea in Ships and only suggested going if you were really interested in the mechanics of whaling, because this film really does go out of its way to realistically portray that industry, which can be quite brutal, but also I'm sure fascinating if you weren't scarred by the Cove like me. But critics did love Clara, and it's easy to see why her performance would have surprised and excited them. I'd never have guessed that this was essentially her first film. I mean, well, maybe because she does look like a child, but she's so comfortable and confident, showing no reservations in her physicality, a comedic instinct that lightens the mood significantly, and a bright smile that photographs really well. And so, Down to the Sea in Ships launched Clara's career in earnest, catching the attention not just of critics, but also of Hollywood producers. She soon signed a contract with BP Schulberg and Preferred Pictures. Schulberg saw potential in Clara and the role she'd played in Down to the Sea in Ships. Remember, Dot was mischievous and restless. She didn't care if someone told her no. She didn't care if something was supposedly outside the bounds of her gender. If she wanted to do something, she did it. And even if she got into trouble, the plot ultimately resolved any of the mess. The film may have taken place in the 19th century, but it perfectly laid the foundation for the type of modern girl Clara would play again and again throughout her career: the flapper. Flapper is a term with both political and cinematic implications. By this point, we all probably have a mental image of what a flapper looks like. It's become such a Halloween costume stereotype that it's sort of easy to forget how radically these women reshaped American life. The end of World War I ushered in both a loosening of literal restrictions on women's behavior and the rejection of Victorian social taboos, meaning the new woman of the 1920s experienced unprecedented agency over her own social and sexual life. White American women won the right to vote in 1920, birth control became widely available for the first time, college enrollment increased, employment increased, and in new professions. And famously, young women abandoned the long dresses, minimal makeup, and complex, lengthy hairstyles of the Victorian era for more revealing styles that allowed for greater mobility. I'll point you to Karolina Zabrowska's video about the fashion of the 1920s for a better breakdown on that. These women enjoyed shopping, drinking, smoking, dancing, and dating at a time when, in recent memory, for example, women had been arrested for smoking in public. Inevitably, film reflected these societal changes too. According to Joshua Zeitz, author of Flapper, a madcap story of sex, style, celebrity, and the women who made America modern, films produced between 1908 and 1912 tended to follow set plot lines. Leading men and women turned inward to find strength and thereby prevailed over insidious threats to Victorian virtue, over alcohol, material indulgence, sexual urges, crime, passion. Stars like Mary Pickford prospered in that era. She was America's sweetheart, lively and charming, yet demure and innocent, sporting long curls and representing sincerity and virtue. There were unvirtuous women, vamps like Theda Bara, but they were always portrayed as foreign and exotic, distancing their sensuality from the everyday lives of American women. By the 1920s, these types were out, along with the Victorian ethos and fashions they epitomized. A new decade required a new kind of star, and flappers were it. Janine Basinger writes in her book, Silent Stars, "One thing is clear. It was the movies that made the flapper an icon. The movies told Americans who the flapper was, what she wore, how she behaved, and why she was different from other female movie types. The flapper wasn't a siren or a vamp or a femme fatale. She wasn't innocent, and she wasn't maternal. She was a naughty, grown-up girl who wanted to play with boys, to cause trouble, and to be mischievous. Her role was to embody the evolution of the old-fashioned girl into the modern woman. Gone was the demure American girl all covered up. Here is a girl who could jump into the shower, throw on a dress, and hop out the door. Freedom. It all spelled freedom. And with freedom came other, more daring freedoms, staying out late, driving in fast cars, drinking from whiskey flasks, and of course, the big one, the freedom to have sex. And that's where Clara Bow comes in. This type defined her career almost from its very beginning. The director of Black Oxen, just her third film, described Clara as the ideal society flapper. Vivacious, intelligent, frank, and attractive enough to be the center of interest at any party. Her filmography is full of characters who embody exactly those characteristics. They energetically dash through life, they're young and vibrant, enjoy parties and dancing, and most importantly, they pursue men. They do not wait to be pursued. Take this scene in Children of Divorce. She leads a group of seemingly stiff workers into an office before setting them absolutely loose with a water cooler filled with wine. Clara's not in the office to work, she's there to play. Before long, her crush, in whose office she conveniently staged the party, joins in too, and they go out for a night on the town together. The typical Clara Bow film usually involves some kind of love triangle. She wants a man who's already taken or slightly out of reach, or is with a good man already but briefly flirts with a different option before returning to him. There's often a boring other girl in the cast to contrast with her eccentric antics, and then there's some kind of misunderstanding and she has to fix everything to win the affection of her love. 1927's Get Your Man is a great example. She plays a young girl on an unchaperoned trip to Paris, where she falls in love with an aristocrat type, who unfortunately has had his marriage plans arranged since birth. She sneaks into his family home, meets his father and fiancé, who, wouldn't you know it, also love someone else, so Clara, and well, the audience, doesn't have to feel bad about breaking them up. Of course, miscommunication happens and the man nearly leaves her, but Clara fixes the problem with a wacky scheme. She invites him into her room at night under the auspices of needing help to close a window, then throws around a bunch of furniture and dances around, attracting attention so that people will find the two of them embracing, which she feels so bad about. Not really. With the man's honor threatened, and almost no one in the room actually invested in seeing him marry his original fiancé, Clara wins the day. She got her man. It can all be a bit silly, but Clara makes so much of it. Her characters have such unbridled confidence and a love of living that quite simply just always makes her seem like the coolest, funniest person in the room. This scene in The Wild Party, one of her sound films, is one of my favorites. She and her friends have just arrived at a costume party, and she leads the group, hyping them up to arrive in style.
Courage, me gals. Now all together. 1, 2, 3.
Here's another favorite from It. She's going out for dinner at the Ritz, but she doesn't really have a fancy enough dress to suit the occasion. Her solution? Make one. Show some skin, baby. Considering Clara Bow became famous a literal century ago, it's amazing how modern she feels. She's the girl you want to hang out with, and her body language often reads like it would be right at home in a skit on social media in 2024. She doesn't understand what someone's trying to say to her, so she gives a squint and a what? Or she mistakes a real person for a wax figure, glances to the side and gives an oh my god. Her films were meant to feel modern at the time too. She rarely made period pieces, and the dialogue, either in title cards or in her later sound films, was filled with slang, connecting her to the youth culture she was meant to represent. There are occasional exceptions to the Clara as flapper trope, a major one being Wings, a drama set during World War I in which Clara plays more of a girl next door who is mistakenly accused of being loose. Although, don't worry, they still managed to get her into this dress, which doesn't really make sense for a World War I, and they still managed to show some skin, so it is still a Clara Bow movie in that sense. Wings actually won the first Oscar for Best Picture, which Clara, as Paramount's biggest star, accepted on the film's behalf. Clara Bow was not the first flapper on film, but she, along with actresses like Colleen Moore and Louise Brooks, came to represent that era. Moore was the good girl flapper, a comedian whose virtue was never really questioned, while Brooks was the bad girl who paid for her misadventures. And Bow was somewhere in the middle. She was, as Joe Franklin wrote in Classics of the Silver Screen, a sort of flapper-age Peter Pan, a girl who'd never really grown up, didn't fully understand the implications of the hectic life she was pursuing, and whose very naivete and decency always seemed to extricate her from serious problems. Despite the fact that her films have titles like Man Trap and Ladies of the Mob, Clara never really did anything truly bad in her films, especially by today's standards. Sarah Ross points out in her article on the flapper comedienne, the vast majority of flapper films conclude with the flapper explicitly renouncing her experiments with the modern lifestyle and or settling down in a relationship with a conventional man. While selling the film's sexy elements, promotional materials and publicity articles also often made it clear that the protagonist mended her ways by the end, and that the films offered up a lesson. For example, The Plastic Age. Clara plays a party girl named Cynthia Day who falls in love with a college athlete. She corrupts him, so to speak, with the usual flapper activities, and inevitably his athletic performances begin to suffer. So he decides he has to stop seeing her. But eventually she returns a changed woman, quieter, and with her newfound calmness, all is resolved, and the two can live happily ever after. You kind of get to have your cake and eat it too. Indulge in all the fun parts of the jazz age without really alienating anyone with a last-minute pivot back to good behavior. Soon, articles began to delineate the difference between Bow and stars of the previous era. You only get Mary Pickford's kind of beauty by high thinking and clean living. You get it by unselfishness and charity. Janet Gaynor was the type you wanted to rescue and protect. Margaret Clark was the doll you couldn't bear to see handled by careless hands. But the 1920s, they wrote, was distinctly an age of speed, of movement, new cars, new dances, planes that could fly across the ocean. The 1920s moved at a different pace, and Clara had that national quality. Pep. We adore Pep. She moves all the time. When, in any picture, do you ever see Clara still? Her eyes sparkle with an inward fire. She has all the beauty of a fast, thoroughbred horse. A symbol is Clara Bow, a symbol of our idols, speed, and pep. Clara does move a lot. Her acting is very physical, and I'd argue that her constant movement is part of what makes her so convincing and absorbing. She'll often touch the arm of whoever she's talking to or lean into them, creating a kind of intimacy with her co-stars that reads so friendly and believable. She has this wild hair that she constantly plays with and whips around.
Gosh, how I hate that man. And how I'd like to meet him again sometime, perpendicularly.
And take this scene and call her savage, another of Clara's talkies. She's laying down, but she's kicking her feet on the ground, or playing with or chewing on straw. When we finally get to her dialogue, she's exuberant, bouncing up in a way that I can only imagine Clara Bow would. Louise Brooks, who staunchly advocated for keeping Bow's memory alive later in life, liked to cite small choices Clara improvised that gave each scene such clever textures.
You set up, told her what the scene was, and you just let her go. He said, for instance, where she has a little toy dog. Well, he didn't tell her. Remember, she looks at the dog, and she turns around, lifts up its tail, and lifts its eye. That was her idea. Everything she did was completely original, and he said, when you start to direct her, you get mad, because she's doing all these things, and then you run them, and they're wonderful. Another thing she did in that picture was the scene where she goes in to interview him. Remember, she walks across and slides right straight across the desk? All those things were hers, you see. That was what made her so marvelous.
Moments like these build and build throughout each film, maintaining a frenetic pace that you can't help but follow and observe. It is ultimately difficult to watch a Clara Bow film and not fixate on her the whole time. Part of that is because of her charm, and part of that is because her films really give you nothing else to grasp onto. Clara Bow made over 40 films throughout her career, and the truth of the matter is that very few of them measure up to her talent. And believe it or not, this was entirely intentional. Once B.P. Schulberg realized how well liked Clara was, he immediately began finding ways to exploit her popularity. Because Clara was guaranteed to attract huge numbers at the box office, Preferred Pictures, and later Paramount Pictures, where she eventually moved, basically decided they didn't have to put any effort into her films at all. In Running Wild, Sten summarizes what became the Clara Bow formula. 1. Keep it cheap. Audiences were coming to see Clara. No need to throw a lot of money into the production. The less they spent making the film, the more they could rake in at the box office. 2. Her romantic lead didn't matter. Again, people paid to see Clara, so any up-and-coming, down-and-out actor would do. You occasionally get to see Clara with a quality romantic lead like Gary Cooper or Frederick March, but a lot of them are undeniably forgettable. And 3. Clara and her screen characters must appear interchangeable. In the press, Bow was characterized as living a flapper lifestyle. She had fun, loved dating around, and her interviews had an honesty and candidness about them that made her seem like a real person, rather than a distant deity like some of the other stars, a trait that may have endeared her to the public but made her rather unpopular in Hollywood. But one publicity campaign crystallized that image, merging the public and private Clara in one tidy slogan. In 1926, author Eleanor Glynn published a serialized novella titled It in Cosmopolitan magazine. Glynn had become known for her controversial stories about affairs and so on, and her latest was no different, a pulpy study of sex appeal originally written for a male lead. But according to Joseph Roach's book It, Paramount had other ideas. The studio bought the rights to the story and had the script rewritten to feature Bow, hoping to convince Glynn to anoint Clara the It Girl as a kind of publicity move. For $50,000, Glynn agreed. It followed the typical flapper formula. Clara plays a shop girl who has a crush on her manager, who is sadly taken by a personality-less ingenue. In rom-com fashion, he ends up loving Clara, but mistakenly comes to believe that she actually has a baby out of wedlock, gasp, and cuts things off. She learns about the mistake and vows to get back at him for humiliating her, so she crashes his yacht party, makes her move, and voila. It was a veritable sensation, showcasing the traits that made Clara exceptional while neatly attaching new terminology to describe those same indefinable but perceptible traits. The nickname stuck to Bow, but the term has taken on a life of its own in decades since. To CNN, it's an elusive term describing a girl or woman with that certain je ne sais quoi. Vanity Fair, meanwhile, says the it girl can be epitomized by a single woman whose style, beauty, pedigree, and often the scandalously splashy headlines that surround her captivates the masses. Amazingly, their list of it girls through the decades does not include Clara Bow. Vogue defines the it girl as pure zeitgeist, charisma incarnate. In April 2023, The Cut ran an issue dedicated to the legacy of various it girls in New York history. To them, there was at least one essential quality. It girls are the women we can't look away from. They're famous for being out, for being young, for being fun, being famous. Matthew Schneier writes, they're primarily young, though not exclusively. They have a sense of style, especially one unto themselves. A bit of mystery is very it. People had just as much trouble specifically defining it in the 1920s, and luckily Glynn was willing to step in at literally every opportunity to lend a hand.
How does one tell this it in a person? Is it the way they talk or move or...
No, I should say, to give it the most exact description, it is something which emanates from the eyes. Some curious magnetism, and it always comes with people who are perfectly self-confident.
She even appears out of nowhere in the actual film to tell us what it really means. We are told, it is that quality possessed by some which draws all others with its magnetic force. With it, you win all men if you are a woman, and all women if you are a man. It can be a quality of the mind as well as a physical attraction. For later, it is that peculiar quality which some persons possess, which attracts others of the opposite sex. The possessor of it must be absolutely unself-conscious and must have that magnetic sex appeal which is irresistible. Finally, self-confidence and indifference as to whether you are pleasing or not, and something in you that gives the impression that you are not at all cold. That's it. The film's definition is a good reminder that the term it emerged in a very specific social and political context. Modern definitions tend to focus on the it girl's general appeal to the zeitgeist through fashion, beauty, or her characteristics. Bow, of course, had those qualities too. But in 1927, for a culture exploring en masse the role and boundaries of sex in casual social settings for the first time, it was not just a useful term to describe a certain kind of stardom. It represented a new phase in modern womanhood, the emergence of sexual appeal as an acceptable part of a person's public persona. As the it girl, Clara became the avatar for this movement. Her self-assuredness and playfulness, the model for the pursuit of pleasure. It, Sten writes, made her the foremost symbol of sex in a decade preoccupied with the subject. To a generation weaned on Mary Pickford, the change couldn't have been more radical or as welcome. Film scholar Marcia Orgeron writes, Bow became a symbol of all the behavioral possibilities opened up by women's post-suffrage liberation. For this was an era dominated by prosperity and gaiety, particularly in the cinema's depiction of the contemporary world.
Clara Bow was really something because she represented sex wild as far as I was concerned.
Oh, she was somebody. They called her the it girl, and she could project that sex appeal right out there in front of God and everybody.
Undoubtedly, it was one of Clara's best films, and it's usually the one Clara Bow enthusiasts will recommend as an introduction to her work. It was, of course, enormously popular and turned Bow into a superstar on an entirely different level. It also received positive reviews. Mordaunt Hall of the New York Times called it well-mounted and cleverly photographed, and Clara vivacious and saucy. One review read, "There is nothing to this film but Clara Bow. But she is so dynamic, so sure of herself, so abundantly vital, that she makes the film entertaining in spite of itself." That review represents another consequence of Paramount's lack of investment in Clara Bow vehicles. Despite the fact that Bow starred in over 40 films throughout her career, it isn't that easy to find thoughtful, contemporary reviews of her films. More often than not, they're simply reviews of Clara herself. Critics rarely took her work seriously, I'm sure partly because of biases surrounding comedies and young women, of course, but also partly because they knew Paramount wasn't investing in Bow's films, and they could tell. At a certain point, they began to openly lament the fact that she had virtually nothing to work with beyond her own charisma. Not much of a picture for Clara Bow, who deserves better material. Being a reliable breadwinner, she's been left to shift by herself. The producers figured she didn't need stories any more than clothes. Why spend any money on Clara? She has the ideas, why bother a scenario writer? Columnist Adela Rogers St. John's put it more bluntly, poor pictures have dimmed the blazing light of her success. Bow also understood Paramount was depriving her of good material, and candidly expressed interest in more serious roles that would allow her to evolve and exercise her skill more rigorously.
Very much. I would like to be known as a serious actress and not as a it girl.
I want to do some real acting, she said. The first thing they think about when they get a story lined up for me is, well, how can we get Clara undressed? I want to act. But Paramount never really made an effort to improve Clara's situation on screen or off. She had been vastly underpaid compared to her peers, having had virtually no resources to understand the contract she was signing upon arriving in Hollywood. They also pushed her into a hefty workload, often working on multiple films at once from 6 a.m. to midnight 6 days a week. One would think that would leave little time for Clara to develop a personal life, but that couldn't be farther from the truth. Clara Bow made her last feature film in 1933, less than 10 years after she was named a Wampus Baby Star of the Future. In the late 1920s, Clara's complete disappearance from film would have seemed inconceivable given her immense popularity. She was, in fact, so popular that her fame frequently became the subject of news coverage. Newspapers reported that she received so many letters from fans that a private post office had been installed at Paramount, the only private post office in the world operated to accommodate cinema celebrities. In May 1928 alone, Bow received 33,727 fan letters, the most mail any star at any studio had ever received in 1 month's time. By 1929, it would grow to over 40,000 a month. The arrival of sound films seems like a likely culprit for prematurely ending a silent star's career. But Bow made a relatively smooth transition to sound films, although she would never have described it that way. Once Paramount realized sound was the way of the future, they rushed her in front of a microphone. And I can't imagine how genuinely terrifying this must have been. First of all, silent film acting and performing dialogue require two very different modes of expression. If Clara emoted as she had in silence while speaking, Sten explains, the effect would be comic in its extremity. In 2 weeks' time, Clara was expected to transform herself from a visually to a verbally communicative actress. And if that weren't daunting enough, imagine knowing that your voice possibly posed an existential threat to your livelihood, and then hearing your own voice for the first time ever. I don't know if young folks these days have had this experience because they hear recordings of their own voices practically from the minute they're born, but your voice sounds very different in a recording than it does inside your own head. And it's really jarring to hear that for the first time. Biographies are filled with silent stars experiencing this brand new technology and immediately bursting into tears in disbelief that they actually sounded like what they heard on the recording. And Clara wasn't an exception. She hated the sound of her own voice and was terrified of a stammer she'd had for years. But generally speaking, people actually liked Bow's voice, which she debuted in the 1929 film The Wild Party. Variety's review stated that Bow's voice won't command as much attention as the Bow this and that, yet it's a voice, enough of a voice to ensure a general belief that Clara can speak as well as look. He then goes on to compliment her legs. All senses are deadened when Clara flashes again. Watching The Wild Party now, it's astonishing that this was her first attempt at acting with dialogue. Yes, there were moments where she overplays things a bit, relying too much on exaggerated facial expressions, but for the most part, she's as inventive and playful as her silent films would suggest.
Well, somebody's got to work around here. We don't.
With a nice tone, an animated delivery, and the occasional slip back into her Brooklyn accent that only adds a flair of personality. How thrilling to hear her singing in the car with her friends.
What's the matter with Winston? We're all right.
Her flirtatiousness, her defiance.
Is that where you wish me?
I said left.
Oh, you mean you're left.
With each line, this new effect enhanced everything the audience already believed about Clara. As Screenland put it, her voice was very Bow, natural, wild, spontaneous, and untamed. You'll like her even more because she is all the more herself. Paramount conducted a successful marketing campaign playing on this sentiment. The public discovered that they didn't know the half of it, wink wink, until they'd heard as well as seen Clara. Unsurprisingly, the voice of the most popular actress in America drew huge numbers at the box office, and before long people were lining up around the block for a ticket to hear Clara speak. So, Clara Bow didn't abandon Hollywood because of sound, at least not exactly. The truth is that Clara had been talking about leaving the film industry for years before she actually did it. Not necessarily because of the things she had to do on the screen, although as I said earlier, she wasn't thrilled about the roles Paramount gave her, but more so because of everything that happened off the screen and the responsibilities that came with being a star of her magnitude. Another change in 1920s society that differentiated it from prior eras was its emphasis on consumption. In particular, the new woman of the 1920s became central to consumer culture. Advertisements became a popular commercial art, catering to the new aspirations and dreams of women. These women were key consumers of movies as well, and the film industry developed ways to cultivate dedicated and returning customers of their products. Film magazines like Photoplay and Motion Picture World played an important role in this process. Marcia Orgeron explains in her article, Making It in Hollywood, Clara Bow, Fandom, and Consumer Culture, that these magazines transformed spectators of celebrity into participants in celebrity culture. Obviously, celebrities had existed before the film industry, and fans had been fanatic forever. In her book, The Drama of Celebrity, Sharon Marcus documents the fanfare surrounding 19th century celebrities like actress Sarah Bernhardt, who also received widespread criticism for familiar things like her weight and who she was dating. But by the 1920s, Orgeron writes, curiosity had become institutionalized and, in effect, normalized, at least in relation to the movie industry, whose studios and fan magazines fed the public information, however fabricated, about stars' lives. But this legitimization of gossip came at a substantial price. Those celebrities who participated in the publicity machine often found themselves possessed of a permanently public life. So much so that, as with Clara Bow, maintaining truly private lives became untenable. Not only were the details of the star's life made public, they belonged to the public and were made readily available, purchasable is perhaps a more accurate way to put it, through the medium of the fan magazine. If Clara was an it girl, someone to emulate, she was also an object to consume, a product peddled by the studio. She endured a level of scrutiny few other stars experienced, partly because she was the most famous object by a wide margin, and partly because her life was dramatic enough to fill 100 columns 10 times over. Remember when I said Paramount wanted to convince the public that Clara was interchangeable with her characters? Well, that wasn't very difficult, because Clara led a dizzying flapper lifestyle in real life. Her affairs were meticulously speculated upon, documented, and debated in fan magazines and newspapers throughout her career, as was every illness, every misspent dollar, every misstep by a friend or relative. A lot of it was frivolous gossip, nothing that most stars didn't experience in one form or another, but some of it went beyond the norm, brazenly straddling the line between journalism and armchair psychology, writing things like, "It's my sincere belief that Clara Bow has never been in love. She has had nothing but synthetic imitations." And that was written by her self-proclaimed friend. Eventually, these stories informed the way people thought about Clara more than her work did. She was just a silly airhead with too many boyfriends. In movies, that was fun and all right. People had much less patience for it in real life. Clara herself gave insight into how fame affected her through those same fan magazines. In Modern Screen, Clara replied to an article that had called her stupid and something of a fool with startling honesty. Fame is a funny thing. I cannot reckon with it. It is supposed to make people very, very happy. Otherwise, why do they strive so hard for it? It's supposed to mean money and the power of doing things you want to do and being admired and having things your own way. I used to think that too, but it hasn't worked out that way. Not since the day they told me I won the contest and Clara Bow became Clara Bow have I known what it means to do what I wanted to do with any peace of mind. If I were editing a newspaper and one of the reporters came running to me saying, Clara Bow has a new boyfriend, I'd say, what, another one? That sort of thing is getting monotonous. We won't run a line on it. Or if I were a particularly sympathetic editor, I'd say, give the poor kid a chance to have a romance in the moonlight instead of the spotlight for a change. Besides, who cares? In spite of all they tell me about the insatiable curiosity of the public, I can't help believing the public isn't nearly so interested in my very personal life as it's cracked up to be. The spotlight pursues. It is the jinx of my life. Jinx of her life is about right. In the early 1930s, a series of scandals spelled disaster for Clara, each one chipping away at her confidence, at Paramount's patience in dealing with crisis management, and at the public's fondness for her. The first scandal involved the ins and outs of her pay structure with Paramount that I think are kind of too complicated to get into here, but essentially, Clara had become involved with a married man. The man's wife threatened to sue Clara, but Paramount paid her off to keep the story out of the press. That did the trick, until Clara found out the woman never accepted the money and went out of her way to figure out where it all went. Guess who probably took it? The press wondered what the hell Clara Bow was randomly doing in Texas, and the whole story exploded from there. The next one involved gambling. In a Nevada casino, Clara played with what she thought were 50-cent chips, but were actually $100 chips. So at the end of the night, when she went to pay what she thought she owed, $69.50, she was told, actually, ma'am, you owe $13,900. She refused to pay it. This became public too. At best, it looked like tone-deaf celebrity flippancy about money in a country dealing with massive unemployment during the Great Depression. At worst, it branded her a cheat and a welsher, which at the time was a very serious insult, enough to scar her reputation. Miss Bow may vanish as the it girl and become known by film fans as the red-haired welsher. The debts were eventually paid, but Bow and Paramount had a hell of a time managing the bad press. Fan magazines started turning against her. Clara doesn't seem to have learned a thing about governing her life, one indignant article in Photoplay ranted. Will she, in some mystic manner, acquire self-discipline, or will she go on allowing her emotions to gallop off with good sense? The next scandal became a media sensation of epic proportions, trumping any Clara story to date. For a detailed breakdown of this situation, I recommend listening to the Clara Bow episode of You Must Remember This, which gives a blow-by-blow account of the whole thing. But here's a quick summary. Clara had an assistant, Daisy DeBow, and a boyfriend, Rex Bell, who didn't trust each other very much, each cynically assuming the other wanted to steal Clara's money. Daisy misheard Rex talking about money, so removed Clara's valuables from her home, thinking she was protecting Clara. Rex and Clara thought Daisy had stolen it all for herself. Things spiraled out of control, and before long, Clara fired Daisy. Daisy blackmailed Clara to try to get her job back, and Clara took her to court. The trial was perfect fodder for gossip columns, and Daisy provided more than they could have hoped for. From dumb, petty accusations like saying Clara wasn't an actual redhead, to deeply inappropriate revelations like submitting Clara's personal love letters to be read as evidence, which were printed word for word in newspapers for everyone to read. Eventually, Clara broke down on the stand, and understandably so. Daisy had been her best friend, like a sister, had managed her life for years, had repaired Clara's financial situation after her family members and acquaintances had stolen from her again and again. And now suddenly, all this. An irredeemable act by an irreplaceable friend. And how else would this be characterized but hysterical? Despite the fact that it was Daisy, not Clara, who'd been accused of and eventually convicted of a crime, Clara's reputation really took a hit. Her dirty laundry had been aired too publicly, crossing a line from pleasantly entertaining to pitifully exposed. As one paper put it, you can't handle a butterfly without stripping the beautiful powder from its wings. To have your fables dragged into the pitiless light of a court is to rob that workaday world of a priceless illusion, and that is a mistake. And an even bigger illusion had been shattered as well. In 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression and ushering in a completely new national ethos that rejected everything Clara had represented throughout the 1920s. Frugality became admired over extravagance, discipline over recklessness, duty over amusement. The same qualities that had earned her affection years prior were suddenly weaponized against her. She was just a little jazz baby, always on the go, sensation mad, a disturbing influence. One paper wondered, is she a victim of box office or her own volcanic nature? Flappers are out of style as completely as boyish bobs. Clara Bow has changed her haircut, but not her behavior. The same rebel spirit that made her the flapper queen of the movies is getting Clara in bad now. Will the immortal flapper learn self-discipline, or is she fated to dance her way into oblivion? To make matters worse, that wasn't the end of Clara's scandals. A gossip paper called the Coast Reporter published a series of so-called exposés about Bow and said that she did some genuinely wild shit, all entirely made up, of course. It claimed that she had a sexual relationship with her dog, that she had drunken threesomes with sex workers in Mexico, that she was a drug addict, and more. The writer, again, tried to blackmail Clara, saying the stories would stop if she simply bought the Coast Reporter for $25,000. Eventually, he was arrested for distributing obscene material. But reading such heinous lies about herself and knowing that some people would believe them regardless of the truth really broke Clara. Her confidence was completely shot to the point that she could barely function on camera. She knew that her mental health necessitated taking time off and begged Paramount for a break, but the studio refused. She tried to continue, but broke down and had to enter a sanitarium. By this point, Paramount was counting the days until Bow's contract was up. Schulberg was done trying to clean up her messes. Her films hadn't been performing like they used to, meaning his product had lost its value. Clara, desperately trying to recover from the stress of her life and suffering from hereditary mental health problems, was eager to leave as well. Eventually, they came to an agreement, and Clara left Paramount to move to a ranch with her new husband, Rex. She returned to make just a few more films, which were quite well received and indicated she probably could have kept acting if she really wanted to. But she'd had enough. At the age of 28, she retired for good. The rest of Clara's life was relatively quiet, but not easy. Her mental health issues only worsened. A suicide attempt sent her to another mental health facility where she was finally diagnosed with schizophrenia. Unresolved traumas from her childhood still haunted her, and the constant pressures and criticisms of stardom had fostered fears and paranoia that she would never quite learn to handle again. Clara secluded herself away from the world, never again consenting to a public appearance or an interview for the rest of her life. The studios were never invested in preserving their silent films. It's estimated that 80% of silent films have been lost due to poor archival practices. And while some of Clara's films have disintegrated into dust for those reasons, we're lucky that some are still available to view. On a positive note, you never know what people are going to find. A copy of 1923's The Pill Pounder was just found in Omaha, Nebraska, of all places, restored and screened at the San Francisco Silent Film Festival this year. That was the first time anyone had seen it in over 100 years. One thing's for sure, Clara Bow is a fascinating window into the past. She was a woman of her time, embodying a modern sense of speed and pep, but also a woman ahead of her time, unconcerned with conventions and willing to break down decorum to be herself. She was a fan who was saved by participating in a fan magazine contest. but who later felt the stinging scrutiny those same magazines could exert on the famous. If you're interested in watching Clara's work, I encourage you to do so. I'll leave links in the description of this video to where you can watch a bunch of them for free. I know that watching silent films might be a barrier for some people, but think of it this way. I think a lot of us are watching silent films all the time and don't even register that they are silent films. The plots move really fast, they're full of dramatic twists and turns, and I really do think Clara Bow is worth it. It's safe to say that Clara Bow was pushing boundaries in her own way on screen. It's one of the reasons I admire her and why I love so many other artists as well. I recently visited the Academy Museum in Los Angeles, which currently has an exhibition honoring one such artist, John Waters. It's an incredible show. I highly encourage you to check it out if you're able. And when you're done, head on over to Nebula, where you can learn even more about Waters' unique style and approach to the obscene in Bro Deschanel's original series, Taboo on Screen, which explores films that, to varying degrees of success, attempt to shed light on the shunned, fringe, and uglier aspects of the human condition. It's a wonderful series, and you can only watch it right now on Nebula. As you may already know, I'm a proud member of the Nebula family, which means that all of the videos I've made for you right here on YouTube are also currently streaming ad-free over on Nebula. Everything I make in the future will be too. And one of the reasons I love working with Nebula is because it's creator-founded and creator-led, meaning creators are encouraged to take risks and make things they want to make without worrying about how an algorithm will respond, because Nebula doesn't even have an algorithm. The YouTube algorithm is a fickle beast, and believe me, taking that worry off of our shoulders is more of a relief than you know. Like my friend Liam and I read through Barbra Streisand's giant memoir together. I posted it on Nebula, and I never once worried that it would tank my channel. Incredible. Everything on Nebula, from the originals to the design team that built this snazzy new homepage, everything is paid for with subscriptions. So, signing up for the platform supports my channel tremendously, as well as an entire community of creators. If you sign up using the link in my description, nebula.tv/BeKindRewind, you can support me directly and get Nebula for 40% off an annual plan. That's just a little over $2.50 a month. Right now, Nebula is also offering lifetime memberships. For a one-time $300 fee, you get lifetime access to everything on the streaming service for as long as Nebula exists. You never have to think about managing your subscription again. Every new episode, premiere, series, class, and even Nebula's new feature, Nebula News, will be instantly at your fingertips. Click on the link in my description and start watching.